Andrea Bernstein, a veteran reporter and editor for WNYC and NPR, was, I'm sure, as flabbergasted as the rest of us when Donald Trump was elected president. We New York journalists knew Trump, either one-on-one or from the tabloid gossip columns, and we knew that his qualifications to competently run his own companies, much less the US government, were thin indeed. Andrea got to work doing deep research on Trump's businesses, now and for the past 20 years, and on the history, business connections, and conflicts of interest of those he has surrounded himself with, including Jared Kushner and his wife, Ivanka. One result was the regular reports she produces with ProPublica called Trump Inc., which we broadcast both here and around the country. The second result was the book she published earlier this year, American Oligarchs, the Kushners, the Trumps, and the Marriage of Money and Power. The book is a beautifully written exploration of how money corrupts, now and across the decades. Andrea tells me it is about to come out in paperback, and I strongly recommend that you go to that unnamed company that sells books and buy yourself a copy. Andrea, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And it's really great to be among such distinguished journalistic company. Because I had covered, as many of you know, and have had experience with New York politics for so long, Trump obviously frequently, sort of zoomed across the horizon because he was always giving money to some politician and he was always wanting something. And just paying attention to money and politics in New York, Trump was obviously a factor. But, like a lot of journalists, he wasn't the main thing that I was paying attention to. And when he announced for president, I was sort of like, okay. But at that point, I had covered the Hillary Clinton campaign. I'd covered Hillary Clinton since she started running for a US Senate, which was in 1999. So since the last century. So mainly I was covering her during the campaign, but obviously, as one does, I, would go and look at Trump and Trump rallies. And I think by a December trip that I took to New Hampshire, which was right around the terrorist attack in San Bernardino, I began to understand something about the intensity of emotion on the Republican side and how Trump was speaking to that intensity of emotion. And it became clearer and clearer to me as the campaign went on that the Trump that America was looking at and thinking about voting for was the Trump of The Apprentice, which is how they all knew him. He was not the Trump that we knew from covering him and living around him in New York. And they liked that. It was a TV image. It was a well-produced show. And that is really what they were connecting with. But, like many of us covering the 2016 campaign, we couldn't quite put it together with our heads how Trump was going to win because he broke so many of the rules that we as journalists use to understand what was going to happen in elections. So the election night came. I was in the Javits Center. The glass ceiling was not shattered. And the next morning, after just a couple of hours of sleep, I woke up and like many of us thought, well, what are we going to do now? And I thought about this for a while and I reached out to a number of other journalists. And the idea for a Trump business reporting project began to crystallize quickly in my mind because it became very, very clear, really from the get-go. I mean, there were these early things early on where Ivanka Trump, her company sent out a news alert because she was wearing a bracelet, an Ivanka Trump bracelet in an interview on 60 Minutes. And there were, Donald Trump was meeting with business partners from Indonesia. It became very, very, very quickly that he was going to bring his business with him. And that because I had covered New York politics and the way that real estate intersected with politics, and because real estate is such an important industry, it came up often. I realized I had something that a lot of people who had covered the political campaign didn't really have, which was a really deep understanding of the way Trump's business world had intersected with politics. However, what it became also quickly clear that we didn't have was this sort of reach and just sort of firepower to cover this all, because as many of you know who've dug into Trump's businesses, there's just like nesting shell companies, hundreds of them. Many of them, it's really unclear if they do anything. He doesn't have a huge business, but he has a sprawling business that spans the globe. And it became clear that sort of looking at Trump's business would be like walking around a long hallway with all kinds of doors. And you could go into the door, and behind each door was a maze, and you were never sure if that maze was going to take you to some actual journalistic finding or a dead end. So it quickly became clear that we would need to start working with other journalistic organizations. And we did this. We started working almost right away with ProPublica in an informal partnership that eventually became the Trump Inc. podcast. Along the way, we did a story about how Donald Trump Jr. and Ivanka Trump were almost indicted by DA Cy Vance, in whose case now we are waiting for a Supreme Court decision any minute in a separate case about whether Trump has to turn over his tax returns. And we covered the story about Donald Trump and Ivanka Trump, and we'd had a big partnership with the New Yorker and ProPublica, and we'd been looking at the Trump Soho, and we'd been running down money laundering leads, and I had to learn how to pronounce all of these Russian names. And at the end of the day, the story of what happened at the Trump Soho was in a place I was very familiar with, which was the New York State Board of Elections records. And there was the sort of key to unlocking the story that DA Vance had overruled his own prosecutors and dropped the case after a visit from one of his largest political donors. So that was a sort of template of a kind of story I was very familiar with. So we did that story, and after we did that story, we wanted to keep that going. And so we decided that we were going to start the Trump Inc. podcast. And one of the most fateful decisions we made was that it was going to be an open investigation, that we were not going to understand everything about every deal. So the way we were going to confront that, and that was by design with Trump, because he kept information away from us in so many ways. I mean, he kept information away from us because he was a privately held company, but he and his businesses and his son-in-law's businesses and his daughter's businesses would regularly tell people to sign NDAs. So people couldn't talk to us under threat of violating NDAs. When they did, they were sued. And Trump would regularly bully people on Twitter, so they were afraid to speak out. And then when it came to public disclosure, we obviously all know he didn't release his tax returns, but he also was just always rebuffing public disclosure. So it made it very difficult, and it made it impossible for us to get the kind of complete answers that we as journalists and investigative journalists are used to getting. So when we launched Trump Inc., we explained very clearly to our listeners, we are going to be journalistic, we are going to be fair, but we are also going to be honest when we don't have answers, but we think something might be going on. And we asked for tips. We got contributions from listeners, from former government employees, from former Trump employees, from just citizen journalists, people who would go to their local, somebody who lived in Westchester or Palm Beach would just go to their local records office and find a record and give it to us. And that is how we built the open investigation. There were a lot of things that were very murky to us when we began. And there were a lot of things that we pointed out and we said, this is a really weird thing. For example, it was a really weird thing to us that Michael Cohen had all of these business partners who'd been arrested or convicted or disbarred or lost their professional licenses. And we began to do a big profile of Michael Cohen. The day we were out in the field going to his former high school and his various former haunts and his businesses and asking people about Michael Cohen was the day the FBI raided his offices. So there was a sense that we had that things weren't quite right that kept being validated by law enforcement actions. Paul Manafort was one, Michael Cohen was one, Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman was another. We became very interested in Ukraine and Ukraine's intersection with American politics and planned a trip for, I think, 14 months. And my colleague, Ilya Meritz, arrived in Kyiv basically the day the Ukraine scandal broke. So the idea of an open investigation sort of really kind of paid off journalistically, that we were clear that we didn't know everything, but we were going to try to put the pieces together in a way that they actually would lead to something. And it was sort of inviting people in on the journey and on the journalistic project with us. Sometime in the fall of 2017, this was not long after we had published the story in the New Yorker and with ProPublica on the Trump Soho. I had a meeting with a book editor who had been trying to set up a meeting for a few months, and I was busy and he was busy, and then I thought, oh, we should have that lunch, and we went and we had that lunch, and he said, why don't you write a book on the Trumps and the Kushners? You know these people. It's the same world as Bridgegate, which I had also spent a lot of time covering. And I thought about it for a while, and I came to realize that, yes, it was the same world. It was people that I know. It was so close to me, I didn't even know it. For example, Jared Kushner's family business, not only was his wife involved in the Trump Soho, which was very close to my office, but he had a parcel of land in Brooklyn that was very close to where I lived. There were all kinds of people, and it was a fascinating thing when I went on my book tour who are from Livingston, New Jersey. There always seemed to be somebody in every audience. Maybe there's somebody in this audience from Livingston, New Jersey. And Livingston, New Jersey is a town of 30,000 people where Chris Christie is from and the Kushner family is from. And so there were just so many people that I spoke to, also in New York journalism, that had firsthand knowledge and experience of the events described in the book. And the reason that I wanted to write this book is because I wanted to understand the phenomenon of Trump. I didn't just want to write a story about two families. I wanted to understand how the Trump family and the Kushner family fit into our history, and how decisions that we made as a nation and a democracy opened the door and ushered in the current government, and that it was really decades in the making, in some ways even a century in the making, the actual form of government that we have now. And it is ultimately a story about these families, but it's also a story about our democracy and the way that we have allowed money in. And I think that I will stop there and take your questions, but I am happy to speak to any aspect of the Trump Inc. project, American Oligarchs. Let me just say one other thing about the book, which is that I read all the Trump books. Yeah, and that was a lot of books. And most of them were terrible. And some were very good. But by and large, there's this whole sort of genre of, especially the tell-all by somebody that just kind of pops out, and it has a, interesting idea, but it's a terrible read. And I vowed along the way, I want to write a book that people will want to read now, and that people will want to read 10 years from now, and that they'll want to read 50 years from now, to understand this moment in American life And I wanted it also to just be a great read, something that you would pick up at the beginning and you would read through to the end and you would think like, wow, I have understand something about the world, and it was a satisfying reading experience. So I hope that I have achieved that. It was a very conscious goal. So now I am happy to take your questions or to keep talking.
In your book, you take the Kushners and the Trumps, all the way back to Europe. You find certain parallels in their their recent history, not in their World War II history. And I wonder if you want to talk about that. You sort of conclude that these are the same sorts of people who feel that they're privileged to bend the rules.
So let me talk a little bit about the research for the book and the two families. On the Trump side, there were a number of really terrific books that sort of came out early. I mean, I think the iconic book about Trump is Wayne Barrett's book, which was The Deals and the Downfall. And he writes in his introduction to the original version, if anybody's read it, that Trump's spokesman called him and said, he's coming back, but he still called his book The Deals and the Downfall. The later title was The Greatest Show on Earth. So that biography in many ways is just seminal. Nobody has ever achieved some of the feats of investigative reporting. And one of the things I was really lucky to do when I was working on the book was I went down to the University of Texas at Austin, where his papers are stored. And I mean, at that time, it was just like the same jumble that had come off Wayne's desk. It was 300 boxes of things that were in no particular order. But it was just an incredible 40-year history of New York City corruption. And I was able to find many of his original notes. I was really sort of able to piece together how he pieced together the Trump story. Two other books that were sort of really important on the Trump side in understanding his biography were Gwenda Blair's three-generation biography of the Trumps and Tim O'Brien's book on, which, I think we all understand the sort of way that book figured in history was he was the one who really called out Trump for not being a billionaire, and Trump sued him and lost. And that sort of Tim O'Brien's scrutiny of Trump continues to this day. So there were a number of people who had gone over the work. And what I wanted to do was, do my own original research and sort of synthesize that into the story that was developing. But there were no such sources really on the Kushner side. There were no deep biographies. There was no real understanding of the Kushner family business. And so that was a lot of just original, basic historical research. And there were a few things that I did to put that together. One is, at the very early stages of my book, I was speaking about Jared Kushner's grandmother and how she had given a couple of testimonies, Holocaust testimonies. And somebody said to me, well, is her story true? And I was sort of taken aback because it hadn't occurred to me that it wouldn't be true. But I thought, okay, I'm going to have to report this like I report everything. So I listened to her testimony. She gave two of them about a decade apart, as well as I got in touch with the Holocaust Museum and I said, I'd like to listen to oral histories of everybody that came from this town in Poland where she came from. Her story was extraordinary. She had grown up in a town called Nowogródek in northeast Poland. And her family was sort of comfortable, upper middle class. Her father was a furrier. Kushner means furrier. They had 2 stores. There was a big Jewish civic life in Nowogródek. And they were participating, and they began to hear distant thunder. They began to hear about the Germans coming in southern Poland and killing people, but they thought, no, that can't be true. And then the Nazis march in, and at first things are okay. They're forced to wear yellow stars. They're not allowed to walk on the sidewalks anymore. But they can continue with their lives. They can continue to run their businesses. They can walk. They can walk down the street. I don't want to say freely, but they can go from place to place. And they think, okay, how much worse could it get? And then there's a massacre, and 50 people are shot. And they begin to think, okay, those were people that were troublemakers. That's why they were shot. And I'm not a troublemaker, so I won't be shot. But of course, that didn't happen. And there was this denialism, and thousands of more people would die after they said things like that to themselves. There was a massacre in the courthouse. On that day, Jared Kushner's grandmother and her sister were online basically to go, and the Nazis were sort of saying, you go to the left and you go to the right, and one was to live and one was to die. And Jared Kushner's great grandmother yelled to her daughters, run in opposite directions so one of you may live. And that is what happened. Jared Kushner's grandmother, Ray Kushner, lived. Her sister, Esther, did not. She was murdered by the Nazis. And on it goes until there are just a few hundred left, and they realize they're going to die too, unless they escape. So they do escape. They dig a tunnel. They dig out bags of dirt from underneath the ghetto wall and the barbed wire and the Nazi dogs, and past the searchlights. And the tunnel is about 2 football fields long, and it is about 2 feet wide. And they crawl through it one very rainy night on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, and they get out. Everyone escapes. Some people are caught by the Nazis after they get out, but everybody gets out of the tunnel. Jared Kushner's grandmother and her sister and their father make it through to the forest, where they live with the Bielski brothers and a band of Jewish partisans, and they live out the war there. After the war, they pose as Greeks to get on a train out of Poland, and they walk across borders, and they illegally go around border guards, and they get to a refugee camp in Italy, and they're stuck there for 4 years, basically, because the immigration laws in New York, even after all that was known about the Nazis, is so constricted against Jews. And what the Kushners figure out while they are there in the displaced persons camp is if they change their identities, they will satisfy US immigration rules. So that is what they do. Jared Kushner's grandfather, who was born Yussel Berkowitz, changes his name to Joe Kushner and poses as his father-in-law's son. And his grandmother, Ray Kushner, poses as her own father's daughter-in-law and uses a name for her pre-married name that wasn't her own. And they get approved, and they immigrate to the United States, and they arrive in the United States with $2 in their pocket, and they get help from the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, known as HIAS. They get established. Joe Kushner goes to work as a carpenter. He's a very frugal person. He'll sleep out on his job site so he doesn't have to pay the bus fare back to Brooklyn. And eventually they save up money and they buy a parcel of land in Clark County, New Jersey. And this is the sort of beginning of the Kushner real estate empire, where they buy land, they build buildings, they sell it, and then they build another land. It's sort of normal real estate. And to understand all of this, with the help of a researcher, we dug up all of the Kushner family land records that we could from this period. The original the original documents, which I have on copies of microfiche, and we looked them over and we put together the piece of this. And it was the sort of Kushner Company's beginning was a very typical New York story, which is that they were able to succeed with a big boost of taxpayer aid in various ways. There was, for example, how there was the Interstate Highway Act, which built the highways, which enabled people to get to the suburbs, which made the homes. They were built building valuable. There were mortgage tax deductions, and there was also federally backed loan insurance, all of which contributed to the construction of the suburbs. In New Jersey, during this period, 1,000 homes a week for 1,000 straight weeks. It was a big, it was one of the fastest growing areas of the country after the war, were the suburbs around New York. So that is how I put together the story of the Kushner family, and I was actually able to get the original records, the original case notes from their highest file that described how they arrived in the United States, and that's part of the book. And the story of sort of success, but success buoyed by taxpayers, that becomes over the generations a story of figuring out ways to not give back to the taxpayers. Corruption in the Kushner family case, actual crimes, tax evasion, campaign finance, and witness tampering, which I'm sure many of you know the details of the story of Charles Kushner and his arrest by one Christopher J. Christie. And that is the story of the American dream that I'm telling, that begins in these incredibly trying conditions and ends up in the White House. Just one note on dirt. The story of the dirt being dug out from Novogrudek is incredibly significant, because shortly after Trump was elected, Jared Kushner met with a Russian banker. And it's in the Mueller report about how the Russian banker had done so much research on Jared Kushner and preparation for the meeting that he had sent someone to the town of Novogrudek to get a bag of dirt, which is obviously incredibly significant. Jared Kushner said, I was so uninterested in this meeting. He didn't say I was so uninterested, but he said it meant so little to me effectively that I didn't even Google the person he was meeting with. And that is the kind of information asymmetry that we began this administration with. So there's a very long answer to your question, and I'm happy to take more questions.
In relation to that, how Jewish are Jared and Ivanka, and how does Donald really feel about that? Because on the one hand, people consider him anti-Semite. On the other hand, how could he be? His daughter and his son-in-law are very Jewish.
They're quite observant. And this is just a quick paragraph from the prologue of the book. Ivanka and Jared's wedding was Jewish in a Trumpian way. As women arrived, they were given elegant shawls to guard against the autumnal chill as the sun slid down the sky, but also to cover their shoulders. Ivanka herself wore a Vera Wang wedding dress, shoulders covered by white lace sleeves extending down to her elbows. In some dances, women were separated from men in the Orthodox tradition. The food served in a separate dinner tent. Also enormous was kosher. A rabbi had walked through the tent, koshering a caterer's knife by dipping it in water. Charles Kushner's speech was a variant of the one he gave at every family event, every simcha, Yiddish and Hebrew for joy, a metamnim for joyous occasion, about being the son of Holocaust survivors, about the miracle of survival, about Jews thriving and prevailing, about the values of family and chesed, Hebrew for compassion or grace and Torah. He spoke about Ivanka and how she'd worked so hard to become Jewish and how the family embraced her now. Donald Trump had been bewildered by his daughter's conversion, but was gracious at her wedding. He spoke appreciatively and uncharacteristically of his first wife, Ivana, and all the work she had done to raise Ivanka, acknowledging he hadn't always been an attentive parent. The guests who'd come to the wedding with a mix of curiosity and anticipation and obligation and appreciation were greeted warmly. They felt, for a fleeting instance perhaps, the gravitational pull of Donald Trump's personality. That night, as guests left clutching their giveaway prayer books and a pair of Havaiana flip-flops that said Jared on one and Ivanka on the other, laced through with a string calling them a great pair, they were forced to embrace Trump's ostentatiousness, even as they participated in his display, to pay tribute to this marriage of money and power, to acknowledge the authority of the patriarchs. From the vantage point of everything they had built, the families could say, "We've arrived. You are complicit in our power. We are a force to be reckoned with. Pay respect to us." Foolishly, the world did not. Just a quick backstory was that when Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump were dating, Charles Kushner and also his wife and Jared's mother, Sarah Kushner, did not want Jared to marry someone who wasn't Orthodox, and they broke up for a while. It was Rupert Murdoch and Wendy Murdoch who brought them back together in a weekend on their yacht where they invited each of them and didn't tell the other. Donald Trump was sort of confused by why Ivanka would go to all that work to becoming a Jew. But in the end of the day, she's the apple of his eye. So if that's what she wanted, he was going to go along with it.
Did the Trump administration do anything to try to prevent it from being published?
Nobody tried to prevent the book from being published. There was, I think, for obvious reasons, a lot of pushback. There are some facts in the book about Charlie Kushner's criminal case that he pleaded guilty to avoid ever becoming public. And you will find them in the Charlie Kushner chapters of the book. And there was a lot of legal, the kind of thing that lawyers tell journalists, which is to make some people very uncomfortable. And at the end of the day, I said, I know I have this nailed down. I know it's true. And I'm going forward with it. But it was unnerving to go through that experience. At the same time, I talked to hundreds of people for this book. And I feel like, 5 of them, maybe more than 5, but not very many wanted to go on the record. And many of them, it was because they've been traumatized by their own experiences with somebody Trump or somebody Kushner. And there were people who said, so-and-so Kushner or so-and-so Trump ruined me. So it was unnerving to sort of, in effect, get the message, if, you don't get this right, we're going to ruin you. At the same time, I was talking to people that were saying we were ruined. And that was sort of the end stage of getting the book together, which was all going on as the Ukraine scandal was breaking. So that was sort of putting together the book. But no, there wasn't at the end of the day. And, I made many, many, many attempts to get questions from Ivanka Trump and Jared Trump and Donald Trump and Charles Kushner were sort of the main characters, if you will, of the book. And Donald Trump and Ivanka Trump did not answer the questions. Jared Kushner, through a White House spokesman, answered some, and Charlie Kushner, through his lawyer, answered some. But that was the extent of the interactions with the family.
Let's move to the present day. How do you see the campaigns, the election, their business activities, and their profiting from presidency and being related to the president? Does that have any impact on people's votes?
So the answer is to the last question, I don't know. I think, so there's a couple of ways I'm going to answer this. One is that when we started to cover Trump business, my colleague Ilya Meritz and I had covered sort of money, power, and influence, and he had covered New York business. And we decided to join together in this project of covering Trump business. And, at that time, despite the Wayne's work and Tim O'Brien's work and some really strong work during the 2016 campaign, there was not really a very big understanding of Trump's business. And, again, that was by design. He doesn't want us to understand his business, and he takes extraordinary efforts and goes to extraordinary lengths to make sure we don't. But Ilya said to me, okay, so what if we find out that basically this looks like a normal business and we spend a lot of time figuring that out? Is that okay? And I was like, yes, that's fine, because, what else you can do as a journalist? But having examined so many Trump deals, there is not one of them that looks completely normal. There seems to always be some business partner who's had some kind of brush with the law. There are reasons why the fundamentals of his properties are questionable. There are unsatisfied customers galore who have sued him. There have been various criminal investigations. So his business, I think we have found, is, it's a profoundly, corrupted business. His original deal in Manhattan for, what is now the Grand Hyatt Hotel, then it was the Commodore Hotel, Trump lied to bankers saying he had state approvals. He lied to the city and the state saying he had the bank approvals. He submitted a document to the Urban Development Corporation without any signatures. And then he boasted about the whole thing in The Art of the Deal. So that was the deal that sort of made him a Manhattan real estate mogul. And, from Trump Tower, which was one of the pioneers of this, at that time, new form of ownership, limited liability companies, which hid the fact that there were, actual criminals sort of basically pouring money into Trump Tower, to, sort of more current deals. For example, one that his company is going now in Uruguay, which is a haven for money laundering, or deals that they're trying to do in India, which has one of the worst ratings in the world on corruption and transparency. So Trump's business deals are not normal business deals. And his presidency, and in fact, we're working on our final episode of Trump Inc. now, where we're sort of looking at how it is not any single deal that makes us understand Trump, but it's the way that by engaging in these practices and shirking off accountability, fighting journalists, fighting in the courts to keep his records, that he has ended up really corrupting the sort of entire process of government. So many of our institutions are unrecognizable now. And I think that is the kind of big lesson of where we are in the campaign, that there is, a lot of work we're going to do post-Trump, whenever that is, whether it's, now or in 4 years from now, to restore institutions of democracy. I mean, the final thought that I have about his campaign is that his campaign is, there was an AP story yesterday that detailed all of the spending, all of the ways that Trump has sort of wasted money on this and that. And it sounded like nothing so much as reading the New Jersey Gaming Commission's report on his casinos and how he had basically looted them and he had overspent and he had this crazy non-functioning business model. Trump, as we know, has a business model of failure. He succeeds by being able to convince enough people to go in on him with his next venture. And, he's left just a trail of tears of customers, business partners, bankers, and, in some cases, the American people. If you look at his handling of the virus, the people are... His way of succeeding in business is to get you to focus on the next thing. And in his campaign and in what we've learned from the New York Times, his incredible work getting his tax returns, we see how it is possible that the clock is running out on that.
I wonder why none of this matters to that 40%.
One of the things that I really talk about in my book is the way that there was this really decades-long effort to undermine faith in American institutions and particularly government. And there's a scene about 2/3 of the way of my book where I'm in Canton, Ohio, which is, one of these towns that was going to be someplace, and there were these beautiful banks and, theaters and beautiful stone structures, all of it built in the early to mid-1900s. And this was just one of these towns that was boarded up and people were desperate. And while I was there and I was working on filing my story, I had the TV on, which is something that I do because I want to know what's airing in each market. It's just ad after ad after ad about so-and-so running for government, stole this, stole that, everything but, kidnapped your wife and murdered your husband. I mean, just so much profound distrust in government being sowed. And that was right in the wake of the Citizens United decision. So it's not a surprise when Trump comes in And he is playing on that distrust. And he says, I alone can fix it. But of course, he doesn't fix it. But one of the things that Trump has managed to do so well is to live in an information ecosystem and to just, sort of foment the division that's already there between how people get their news and their news sources. So, obviously, I'm not really covering the campaign, and I haven't spoken to voters in this campaign the way that I, typically would do. And I think one of the difficulties with this campaign is it's really hard for people to do that because of the pandemic. But one of the things that is coming through is that if you are in a, sort of Trumpian information environment, the information you are getting tells you to distrust all of this other information. And also, it tells you to distrust the truth. And one of the very big projects of my book, and one of the things that I have faith in, is that, the work that I do and that we do as a collaborative and that we all do as sort of journalists committed to this enterprise is really it's sort of, it's kind of upholding a thing that we believe in and trying to keep that thing alive, which is a common understanding of the truth, science, evidence, facts, all of the things that we trade in, because if we don't rebuild that, we're never going to rebuild our society.
Do you think if he's not reelected that he'll be prosecuted?
This is one of the things I'm really reckoning with. Unless it's happened while we were talking, the Supreme Court has not yet ruled on whether DA Cyrus Vance can get Trump's tax returns. If Vance does get his tax returns, and it looks like he might, because he lost at the Supreme Court and then he went back and he claimed that the subpoena was overbroad, but he doesn't really have a constitutional issue this time around. So a number of constitutional scholars have told me they think it unlikely that it will go to the Supreme Court, that they'll take it up. So if they don't take it up, Trump does have to turn over his taxes to DA Cy Vance. And DA Cy Vance has really, really, really fought to get these tax returns. So my assumption is that they are not on the fence about whether they think there's a case here. They do, because they've really gone to a lot of effort to get them. And so if they get the tax returns, which we will learn any day now, or possibly after the election, it's not clear, there'll be an investigation. We ourselves would only see them if there was some court record filed. But looking at all, and I've sort of read all of the filings and I've been out to all the court hearings, and I've also looked at Trump's business records, and the pattern is pretty clear that when Trump doesn't want to pay taxes, he undervalues his properties, and when he wants to get something like a bank loan that depends on their high value, he overvalues them. We know that from what's in the public record. So it seems like the Manhattan criminal case is likely to go forward, assuming it isn't blocked by the Supreme Court. The Attorney General of New York, Tish James, is also suing in a sort of, or doing a civil investigation of what the Trumps paid taxes. And again, the information in the public filing suggests that she also has quite a strong case, and she was able to actually depose Eric Trump. I think it was last week, but the weeks run together, so it's hard to tell. So those two New York cases, I think, are likely to go forward. I hate to say likely. I hate to use the word expected, because all of these words have, we live in an age where obviously lots of unlikely things happen and unexpected things happen. But based on what I know now, I think that could happen. What about the Justice Department? I think that's the bigger question, is will the United States Justice Department take action against Trump, and should it? And this is still a really open question that we are reckoning with, because we don't want to become like Ukraine, where somebody wins and then they put the person that ran against them in jail. That is destructive. That is something that it's been bipartisan American policy for decades to fight. On the other hand, should there be a reckoning if the president committed federal crimes? This is something I think that is going to be a major preoccupation in any post-Trump era.
And the Kushners? What will happen to them if he loses?
I think there's a couple of different questions. By the Kushners, you mean Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump, or do you mean the Kushner family business? Or both?
Yeah, well, Jared. Jared has only been accused of being a slumlord, but that's not illegal.
Well, I think that, the Kushner family business has changed a lot, and it's been kind of contradictory what it's meant for the Kushner family. There were people who advised Charlie Kushner when Trump was elected that Jared should completely divest and separate himself from the company, and he didn't do that. And what that's meant is every time the Kushner Company gets a big loan or does a big deal, there's all this scrutiny. And what that's meant is that a lot of most New York real estate developers of repute are not interested in partnering with Kushner companies right now. And many banks of repute are not interested in making loans because they don't want the headline risk. So in some ways, it's been, I haven't been to Times Square recently, but the Kushners owned the old New York Times building. The last time I was there, which was, sometime last spring, prior to the pandemic, one of their big properties on the first floor of the old New York Times building had a sign out for front, rent this property for information, email info@rayleasing.com. You'll remember Ray is Jared Kushner's grandmother. So the company has been under pressure in some ways. It has invested more in sort of what was a foundation of the business longer ago, which was multifamily, suburban and exurban properties. They recently got an $800 million loan package from Freddie Mac that my colleague Heather Vogel did some excellent digging into and found that the terms were unusually favorable after Jared Kushner's sister had paid to call in loan officials who were making the decision. So on some senses, they've been under pressure. In other senses, they've been able to get help from the federal government that maybe they couldn't have gotten. It's very unclear, again, because of all of the ways that this is, sort of kept secret from us and the windows and doors that are closed to our seeing in. From what Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump have said, they really enjoy being in Washington. Ivanka Trump in particular seems to enjoy the Washington life. So it doesn't seem likely that she would come back to her business in the form that we know it or knew it in New York. She is somebody who acts like somebody who wants to run for office in the future. She is in every way like her father, but extremely disciplined and on message, and spends a lot of time talking about the economy, going to events with women or with people of color. So these are things that I recognize as something that somebody wants to run for office will do. That doesn't mean she will run for office. I don't think Jared Kushner ever would run for office. I suspect he would come back to his family business in some way, although that might not be his entire portfolio, just because he's so dedicated to his father and to his family.
Arrest Biden, Trump says. How wild is that?
We can't really forget lock her up. Trump's been entirely consistent on this. He thinks he won the 2016 election by talking about what a crook that he viewed Hillary Clinton was, and he thinks that it's a winning strategy for him to now talk about what a crook Biden is. And he's been totally consistent on this. Long before it was clear that Biden was going to win the Democratic primary, Trump was trying to get the president of Ukraine to investigate him, mostly for the purpose of being able to say there was an investigation and there was some potential dirt. You'll notice that word dirt again. So it's been a, sort of consistent strategy of Trump. I think one of the things about his businesses is he has a set of things that he uses in his businesses over and over and over again. And same with his campaign. He just goes back to his strategy. So I don't think it's surprising. I also think that there's just, having looked so much into how his own children have profited from his presidency, it is kind of striking. I mean, particularly Donald Trump Jr., the way he talks about Hunter Biden, as if Hunter Biden is the one who made all his money off his father's name, and not he, the man with the same name as the president, who goes around the world and everybody understands that he is the son of the president.
I guess in the book that in a recent year, Ivanka and Jared made $82 million.
There's a couple of things that are important, I think, to understand about Trump, in particular real estate deals, but also Kushner, is that, Trump sets up deals so that even if an entity loses money, like his DC hotel, the way he sets up a structure of paying management fees, he and his family members still make money. So they do have an equity stake, and that, the value of that is affected, but nevertheless, they can still make tens of millions of dollars a year from the various family businesses. And that's what's happened with Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump, right up through their most recent disclosures, which is that each year they've made money from their businesses, from rent and royalties. And this is not the value of their assets. This is earnings that they've made while they've been in the White House.
Russia, money from Russia into the Trump organization.
I mean, I think that there's the big deal that we know about, which is the Trump Tower Moscow.
Right.
Which, was obviously kept secret from us. So Trump, we know right now from what's in the public record that Trump had a business interest in Russia that he hid from the American people and that Putin knew about, which is sort of, the definition of compromising information, that Putin had this information that we didn't about the president's business interests. One of the things that I learned recently from Andrew Weissman, who was one of the Mueller prosecutors' recent book called Where Law Ends, was that they decided very early on not to look into Trump's financial records. And he was upset about that because he felt like he had done a lot of, sort of criminal investigations. And when you're investigating somebody, one of the first things you want to understand are their debts and obligations. I was upset about it because I thought, okay, I'm a journalist. There's so many things I can't get, but the prosecutors are going to be able to get them because they have subpoena power. So it was disconcerting to learn how they never looked into that and how we still don't know. There still hasn't been a complete investigation of Trump's potential financial liabilities and entanglements with Russia by any investigative agency with sort of broad authority. There was a bipartisan Senate report, which did get quite a bit of this information out, but sort of not in the way that I think we would want to know with finality. So questions do remain. I mean, we know from the Times' reporting on Trump's tax returns that there's no obvious links to Russia or indebtedness to Russia or deals with Russia that emerged from that. And it may be that there is nothing further there, but the disconcerting thing is that that investigation hasn't been done, and voters are now on the verge of making their second decision about Trump without understanding his business ties to a hostile foreign power.
I have a question that goes back to Jared, asking how good a businessman he really is. The questioner says he's widely regarded as a nebbish who doesn't know what he's doing.
There's a lot of stories in my book, and I think the sort of Fifth Avenue example, 666 Fifth Avenue, is the sort of biggest one. I mean, this is a building that the Kushner family's bought for $1.8 billion when they bought it in 2007, which was the biggest price for an office building at the time. And they took on a lot of debt, a lot of risk. They made a lot of confusing to their business partners management decisions, demanding high rents. Many of the businesses left. They couldn't, they had this big balloon payment at the end. By that time, Jared was in the White House. They were having trouble refinancing it. And at the end of the day, they sort of sold the building for what they paid. So I think if you think about New York real estate, most of you will understand from 2007 to 2018, sort of, being made whole is not what you're seeking if you're in the real estate business. And for much of that time, Jared Kushner was managing the business company, and in particular, that building.
Did you work with him at the Observer?
No, I worked at the Observer, but I left there several years before he started. But it was a very helpful point of overlap journalistically because there were a lot of people that we knew in common.
Is the Observer still out there? I'm sorry.
The Observer is still out there. I don't really think it's the force in journalism that it once was. I mean, but that was a long time happening. I mean, Jared Kushner really accelerated that. When I went to work there, there were just Charlie Bagley was there, and Michael Powell was there, and Catherine Finkelstein, and Nikki Fink, and Candace Bushnell. I mean, it was really a thing, and this was pre-social media. So all of us were reading the Observer because we wanted to understand our city, and we also wanted to understand what opinion makers were thinking. But sort of, I think that a lot of that function was supplanted by social media.
Andrea, we've taken up enough of your time, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Really, I'm just really honored to be joined by all of you. I know that there's a lot going on in everyone's lives.